seen some of the issues that we've seen over the last couple of years. So that's the goal this morning. Keep in mind, I guess, that, we're talking about the National Register, right? So there's various levels of designation. There's a local register, a city, county register. There's the state register in Washington. And then there's the National Register, which is managed by the Park Service, sort of filtered through the states. And then there's the National Historic Landmark Program. So for the federal tax credit projects, they really do need to be on the National Register to sort of take advantage of the program. And there's different kinds of resources that can be listed on the National Register, right? So there can be districts, which are concentrations of buildings, typically next to each other. Think about a downtown core or a neighborhood or a farmstead. So collections of buildings that are next to each other. And then there are buildings, so individual structures, individual resources. There are structures. What's the difference between a building and a structure? Hopefully somebody out there knows, right? So buildings are a form of human shelter. Structures, something other than human shelter. And there are objects, things that can be moved. So you can actually list a train or even an airplane on the National Register. And then there are sites, things where resources where something happens, or the classic one is, a battlefield site or maybe an archaeological site or something of that nature. So all of those things can be listed on the National Register, and theoretically all these categories could be eligible for tax credits as well, because what it needs to be is what's called a certified structure, right? And a certified structure means that it's certified by the National Park Service to be either individually listed on the National Register or certified as a contributing property to a historic district. So those are kind of the two key things that need to happen. And it also has to be an income producing property. So, if you're listing your own property and say, hey, I want to get a tax credit for your own house, it's not going to happen. It's got to be an income producing property. So it's typically commercial, office, retail, agricultural, rental spaces, things like that. Have seen some cases where there's B&Bs that are getting tax credits with some creative tax work done. So it's possible that could happen for sure. So be on the National Register individually or a contributing feature and be income producing. And then you have your application, right? So how do you become certified? So even though if you're individually listed on the National Register, you still need to fill out a Part 1, which is just a certification of verification that a building is actually listed on the register. And it's a fairly quick, easy form. It's a 2-pager, expandable. And it's got everything from, ownership name to contacts, information, the nature of the request, and then a physical description of the building, and, inside and out, and top to bottom, and then a statement of significance. So how does it meet the criteria? That sort of thing. And then obviously photographs and maps are super important as well, because this is a very visual program trying to understand how the building reads not only in its current state, but perhaps what it might look like after you do your tax credit project, which would come at a second part, the Part 2, and even the Part 3, which Kim will tell you about, and David, a little bit later this morning. So for an individual listing, it's the standard National Register process, right? So you just go through the full-blown National Register nomination with those descriptions, the maps, the photos. And one of the differences between doing an individual nomination and a historic district is with an individual nomination, we're talking about the interior of a building as well as the exterior, which oftentimes raises a lot of questions about the integrity of interior spaces and how original do they need to be, and what kind of changes can be made. One of the slight nuances is that if you don't have a previously listed property and you're filling out a Part 1, when it goes off to David and his group at the National Park Service, their tax credit folks review Part 1. So there's a different group reviewing Part 1s than there is if you're just doing a standard National Register nomination. That would go to the keeper's office. Sometimes those two entities, even though they're a National Park Service, are a little bit at odds. And this is an example for you of one that was kind of a challenging one. This was at Woolworths down in downtown Renton, where we had a property that was pretty darn intact from the outside, old Woolworths store, but the inside had been completely gutted. We thought it was significant. We wanted to get it listed on the National Register. They wanted to do a tax credit project. The initial tax credit reviewer at the time said it wasn't eligible. And so there was lots of back and forth and negotiations and work to try and get the nomination up to snuff and get everybody on the same page. So that can happen as well. So I always kind of like to encourage people this, if you can, you really should do a National Register nomination first, kind of get the complete story instead of trying to do them concurrently, although you can do them concurrently, but the risk is, it might sort of pop up that, hey, it's not eligible. So it's best to know sort of ahead of time, if you will. Here's another example of one that was also another challenging one, the East John Street Apartments in Seattle. A great Frederick Arnault apartment building, Tudor style with this cool spiral staircase, but the inside, the rest of the building, the apartments had all been gutted. It was converted into a group health office at one point. So again, was there enough sort of material inside to convey its significance to be listed on the National Register? This was actually nominated and listed under criterion C, so it's possible. And I sort of use these as examples to sort of say that, don't think that something isn't eligible necessarily at your first blush. And Kim and I and the team here at DAP are, we want to see buildings listed. That's our goal, and certainly take advantage of the tax credits. And so some of this is creative writing and sort of putting the right spin on things and telling the right story. So our goal is to always work with you to try and get those things to occur. That's our plan. Here's another weird one that was recently listed that I think is currently undergoing tax credits. More of a commercial building in downtown Spokane, the Dotson building, and again. This building, is pretty altered inside, but it has a great story, interesting story. It was nominated under criterion A, connection to the Greek community and the more illicit side of the Greek community, bars and saloons and arrests and things like that. So it's had kind of this great little side story that is not so obvious in a building. So remember, there's 4 National Register criteria. It doesn't necessarily need to be the architecture, the best thing, and the most important thing out there. It just has to have a story to tell and fit one of those 4 National Register criteria. So individual listing is an option for you. The other option is to be a contributing property to a historic district. And here's an example of a typical sort of application that would come forth for a district. And notice how small the sort of physical description is and the cultural data is on a National Register form. Therefore, the part 1 is super important to sort of fill out and expand that history of the resource to give a more full in-depth analysis of what are the integrity of the building and particularly the interior, right? Because now we're talking about a rehab project. And we want to know, the Park Service wants to know what the interior looks like, which does not happen in a district nomination. So one of the reasons too that if you've got a community, you've got a marginal building, historic districts are often the way to go to do the mass collection and to get their sort of marginal buildings because they're only looking at the exterior facade, not necessarily the interior space when it comes to listing. And of course, oftentimes there's no photos of the building either or the interior spaces. So part 1 becomes very important to sort of get that certified structure through that process as well. And, these things are all over the place. The old nominations are even, worse. Sometimes they don't have photographs. Sometimes the statements of significance are less, black and white photographs, terrible maps, things like that. When you get even into the really old ones from the 70s, there are districts that were listed in the 70s. It literally might have 2 or 3 sentences about each property. And interestingly enough, maybe not a photograph at all. So Snohomish is one of those that kind of falls into that category where we don't have photographs of every building. The other weird thing that you might find in some of those old district nominations is terminology, which can be confusing, right? So remember, it's got to be, in today's language, a contributing structure, a certified contributing structure to a historic district. But some of those old nominations use this terminology of primary, secondary, slash supporting, or tertiary or compatible. So we review those today as anything that's primary or secondary is eligible for the tax credit program, and that tertiary compatible is not. So if you're looking at an old nomination, that might come into play in that scenario. What about a district nomination that was done maybe a long time ago or even 10 years ago, but there's been some rehab work that's done, and now it probably could be a contributing property? What do you need to do? The question is, or the answer is rather, is that you need to amend the existing historic district nomination. So yes, it can be done for individual buildings. These are usually buildings that are done that are within the boundaries of a nomination, to sort of change something from non-contributing to contributing. And in, I guess, special scenarios, you might want to go the opposite way to say something's non-contributing now is possible. So those are supplements to existing National Register nominations. Could happen. Here's an example of a building in Walla Walla that had a pretty massive 50s remodel with that kind of slipcover covering up all the original details, and then later on it returned back to its original appearance up at the top. This is now a contributing property in the Walla Walla Historic District, which is recently listed a couple weeks ago. So that's an interesting kind of things to think about. The other thing to think about is, what is the boundaries of the existing historic district, and how does that fit in with your project? And I would say, sort of generally, boundaries are not moved very easily. They're only really moved, they're certainly not moved for individual buildings. They're typically moved as a sort of comprehensive look at the whole historic district, maybe a change in something what we call period of significance, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So those details, those boundaries, when they were originally drawn, were I know a lot of thought went into them to find those boundaries. And so they can be fairly jagged, like the one that you see up here in Bellingham. They're based on lots of different things that sort of happen for visual and major streets, arterials, things like that. Differentiation patterns of development, and of course integrity of a resource is another way that boundaries are placed. So to think that you're going to expand a historic district to grab one property is probably a little bit unrealistic. Doesn't happen very often, but again, a case-by-case sort of basis. So something to be aware of. I guess here's a list of defining those sort of boundaries and things that you might think of. The other thing to think about is the period of significance is super important when it comes into the tax credit world. And if you looked on a National Register nomination, you can see up here, this period of significance we have surrounded is a span of time. So it's a span of time that something attains significance. So sometimes it's a single construction date, particularly if it was an individually listed building, it might just be that initial date. Or it could be a span of time of the initial date to a major alteration that took place. Or if it's a historic district, could be that earliest building in the district to some major event that happened later on. I would say sort of increasingly, what we're seeing is a lot of historic districts being rewritten to encompass these later changes in downtown areas, particularly as it comes to the post-World War II era sort of resources and facade improvements, storefront changes, things like that. So here's a historic district in Ellensburg that was initially listed with a period of significance of 1889 to 1930. And a rewrite of that nomination took the period of significance all the way up into the 60s, which allowed for a lot of the storefront changes to be considered important, contributing, gave us more buildings that are eligible for the tax credit program, which is always what we want to do. So the idea is to sort of be positive, be a little bit more inclusive, get more buildings as contributing so they can take advantage of those tax credit programs. Because if it's not contributing, no tax credits, right? So that's a sample of one. Here's a sample of one. Pioneer Square is a really interesting case study on multiple sort of terms. The historic district has been rewritten several times. Its period of significance only goes to 1931. So what happens to all the buildings that were affected by the massive earthquake in 49? Lots of cornices were lost. Lots of second, third stories, fourth stories were demolished, and just truncated buildings were listed. So you have to kind of think about the period of significance when you're writing a nomination, and if those details are important, and are those resources going to be contributing or not. The other is looking at new projects that have been done. So the two here on the left are obviously new alterations that have been done. Both those buildings are non-contributing properties in the historic district, even though there's a fairly intact historic building, at least on the top one, with this 90s edition on the top. And then the one on the bottom is a strange sort of scenario of windows out, the opening's still there, but porches being created. So again, really changes the sort of character and quality of that building. So something to think about in that scenario. So if you're working on a historic district, definitely work with your consultant, with me, to sort of think about those nuances and how those might favor in your project. Here's one that I always like. Yeah.
Hey, Michael, you got about 2 minutes.
Perfect. I've got like 3 slides left. Thank you, Kim. Here's one that I always like to think about as well. This is the Axtell House up in Bellingham, and a great one to think about a period of significance as an individual property, right? So it was built in 1902, but it had this massive alteration in 1942, which, in the guise of how the nomination was put together, that alteration has become significant. And so if you were to come in with a tax credit project, it's probably gonna raise a few red flags if you wanted to take off the 1940s edition. Again, a problem with listing, right? Probably couldn't list it without the history of the alteration. So something to think about. And this is my last slide, actually. Just want to talk about a little bit about timing of nominations, right? So there's a tax credit process timing, which Kim is going to talk about, which pretty much goes all year round. You can submit anytime, versus the National Register process to actually get listed is kind of a fixed process, meaning that the review committee only meets 3 times a year. And so that review body, you kind of have to work that into your overall program if you want to get something listed before you start your tax credit project, or even if you're going to get it listed after you start your tax credit project, because you've got to have a listed property in order to take your tax credit in the end. So you can do them concurrently at the same time. You can do your tax credit project and work on an actual National Register listing at the same time. But at the project, the resource has to be listed on the National Register before you take your credits. And that's my last slide, Kim. I just about made it.